The moving truck pulled up to 14 Elmwood Drive on a Tuesday morning in late September, and the whole quiet street seemed to hold its breath. Sarah Mitchell stood on the sidewalk with a cardboard box balanced against her hip, her dark brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail, sweat already forming at the back of her neck even though the morning air was still cool. She was 34 years old, recently divorced, and absolutely terrified of starting over. But here she was. New city, new house, new life. That was the plan anyway. Mom, where does this go? Her son, Tyler, stood behind her holding a box labeled kitchen, fragile in red marker. He was 9 years old, small for his age, with her same dark hair, and his father's sharp green claws response was interrupted. Retry humanity's dark matter warships stunned the Council of the Stars into silence. HFY Sci-Fi Story 12:29 Humanity's dark matter warships stunned the Council of the Stars into silence. A 12-part HFY sci-fi thriller and suspense story. Complete YouTube story time, fresh characters, emotional twists, 75 minutes read. The Council Chamber of the Stars had existed for 11,000 years. It floated in the gravitational center of the Valorian Nebula, a structure so massive that it could swallow Earth's moon and still have room left over for a small asteroid belt. Its walls were made of crystallized starlight, a material that the Valorian architects had spent 4 centuries perfecting, a substance that captured the light of dying stars and held it forever inside its molecular lattice, so that the entire building glowed with a soft, eternal radiance that never dimmed, never flickered, never failed. The chamber's interior was shaped like a great bowl, with hundreds of tiered seats rising in concentric rings from a central speaking floor made of polished black obsidian. Each seat was sized and shaped for the biology of the species that occupied it. The Keth needed seats with 6 separate recliners for their 6 lower appendages. The Drovani required elevated platforms because their bodies were 90% gas cloud and they could not tolerate solid surfaces for extended periods. The Urine, who communicated through bioluminescent skin patterns rather than sound, needed their seats fitted with light translation panels that converted their flashing skin into spoken language for the chamber's universal translation system. There were 47 species represented in the Council of the Stars. 47 civilizations, each of them ancient, each of them powerful, each of them convinced, with varying degrees of arrogance, that they were among the most sophisticated forms of life the universe had ever produced. And for 11,000 years, they had governed the known galaxy with a combination of diplomacy, measured military force, economic leverage, and the quiet, ever-present threat of collective punishment for any civilization that stepped out of line. They had seen empires rise. They had watched civilizations collapse. They had guided species through the terrifying transition from planetary life to interstellar travel, a process the Council called the Awakening, and which most species found to be the single most disorienting experience in their collective history. One day you were a civilization that believed itself alone in the universe, fumbling with primitive faster-than-light prototypes and arguing about planetary politics. The next day, a Council ambassador arrived in orbit above your world and explained, with careful diplomacy and a great deal of patience, that you were not alone, had never been alone, and that a galaxy-wide governing body had been watching you develop for the past several centuries and had finally decided you were ready to be introduced to the rest of the neighborhood. Most species handled this news with a mixture of euphoria and existential crisis. The Council had seen it all before. They had a process for it. They had a process for everything. What they did not have, what they had never needed in 11,000 years of existence, was a process for what was happening right now. Ambassador Thessaly Vrun of the Valorian High Council sat in her elevated seat at the top tier of the chamber, her 4 luminous eyes fixed on the central speaking floor below, her long silver fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of her console, and she tried very hard to keep her expression neutral. This was not easy. Valorians were not naturally neutral creatures. They were expressive, emotional, intensely communicative beings who wore their feelings openly on their elongated faces, and right now, every cell in Thessaly Vrun's body wanted to express the emotion she was feeling, which was a profound and deeply unsettling mixture of shock, awe, and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. She had been an ambassador for 60 years. She had negotiated peace treaties between species that had been at war for centuries. She had facilitated the awakening of 11 different civilizations. She had once talked a Drovani war fleet down from the edge of igniting a star just to prove a diplomatic point. She had never, not once in 60 years, felt fear inside this chamber. Until today. On the central speaking floor below, the human stood. He was not physically impressive. Thessaly had always thought that about humans. They were smaller than most sapient species in the galaxy, with only 2 arms and 2 legs and a single pair of forward-facing eyes and no natural defensive biology whatsoever. No armored plating. No natural venom. No electromagnetic field generation. No camouflage capability. No ability to survive in vacuum or extreme temperatures or high radiation environments without technological assistance. By every biological metric the Council used to assess a species' innate power, humans ranked in the bottom 12% of all known sapient life. And yet, the human on the speaking floor was named Commander James Reeves. He was 41 years old, lean and straight-backed, with short gray-streaked hair and calm brown eyes that had seen things. Thessaly could tell just by looking at him that very few living beings of any species had ever witnessed. He wore the dark uniform of the United Earth Defense Force, which the Council had previously considered a mildly charming, slightly primitive military organization that humanity had assembled in the 30 years since their awakening, largely because they were nervous about being the newest and weakest member of an interstellar community they didn't fully understand yet. That assessment, Thessaly now realized, had been catastrophically wrong. Commander Reeves stood at the center of the obsidian floor with his hands clasped behind his back, and he looked up at the hundreds of representatives of the 47 most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy with an expression of absolute, unshakable calm. As if he were the one who had called this meeting. As if he were the one in charge. The chamber was silent. This was extraordinary. The Council Chamber of the Stars was never silent. There were always the soft hums of translation systems, the whispered exchanges between representatives and their advisors, the subtle ambient sounds of 47 different biological life forms breathing and shifting and existing together in a shared space. There was always noise. Right now, there was nothing. Because 3 hours ago, on the outer edge of the Coelum sector, a region of space that the Council had designated as a restricted military zone, something had appeared. Not one something. 42 somethings. 42 warships, each one larger than anything the Council's collective military forces had ever constructed, had dropped out of what the Council's sensors initially identified as standard faster-than-light travel, and then immediately reclassified as something else entirely because the energy signature was wrong. It was not the familiar blue-white burst of a standard FTL drive. It was not the crimson fold signature of a Keth displacement engine. It was not any known form of faster-than-light travel that the Council's 11,000 years of accumulated scientific knowledge had ever documented. It was dark. The ships had arrived in darkness. Not metaphorical darkness. Literal, measurable, scientifically verifiable darkness. A bubble of space around each vessel in which light itself did not function. In which electromagnetic radiation of every frequency was absorbed completely and utterly, leaving behind a void so absolute that the Council sensors had initially reported empty space and only registered the presence of the ships when their gravity wells began affecting the surrounding stellar matter. The ships were invisible to every sensor the Council possessed. They could only be detected by the shape of the absence they created. And they were enormous. The smallest of the 42 vessels was 11 kilometers long. The largest was 47 kilometers from bow to stern, larger than most moons of significant size, and it moved through space with a silence and a grace that made the Council's most experienced military commanders go very, very quiet when they looked at it on their displays. The Council had scrambled its combined military response fleet. 412 warships, representing the collective military might of 31 of the 47 member species, had formed up in the Coelum sector, weapons charged, targeting systems locked. And Commander James Reeves had opened a communication channel and said, very politely, that he would like to address the full council at their earliest convenience, and that perhaps it would be best if the response fleet stood down because he would hate for anyone to do something they would regret. The response fleet had stood down, not because they were ordered to, because their targeting systems couldn't lock onto the human ships, because their sensors kept sliding off the dark hulls like water off polished stone, because every weapons officer in the fleet had looked at their readouts, looked at the 42 vast dark shapes occluding the stars, and felt something ancient and biological and very hard to argue with. They had felt prey instinct. And that was why Commander James Reeves was standing on the obsidian floor of the Council Chamber of the Stars right now, and why the chamber was completely, utterly, historically silent, and why Thessaly Vrun, who had never once been afraid in 60 years as an ambassador, was gripping the edge of her console hard enough to leave marks. Reeves let the silence breathe for exactly 10 more seconds. Then he spoke. "Ambassadors of the Council," he said, his voice amplified and translated into 47 languages simultaneously by the chamber systems. "Humanity thanks you for the invitation. We have something we'd like to show you. And then, if it please the Council, we have a proposal." He paused, and his calm brown eyes moved slowly around the chamber, meeting the gazes of beings of every shape and biology and color and form. "We apologize," he added, "for the surprise. We wanted to be sure of the technology before we presented it. Humans are like that. We prefer to show rather than tell." And then, because he was Commander James Reeves, and he had been selected for exactly this moment partly because he had a precise, almost surgical understanding of how to use silence as a weapon, he stopped talking and waited. The silence stretched. And then, from the Keth delegation on the eastern tier, came the sound that the Council's translation system rendered as, "What in the 11,000 years of recorded history are those ships?" And the chamber exploded. 12 hours earlier, in the command bay of the UEDF flagship Endless Horizon, Captain Maya Chen had been staring at the same holographic readout for the 4th time in an hour, convinced she was misreading it. She was 38 years old, born in Shanghai, raised between 3 different continents as her parents' careers moved them around a planet that was still, even 30 years after first contact, struggling to fully comprehend its new place in a galaxy it had only recently discovered it shared with several hundred other sapient species. Maya had joined the UEDF at 22, had risen through the ranks with a combination of raw intelligence, unnerving tactical instincts, and a capacity for calm under pressure that her commanding officers had repeatedly described in her evaluation reports as frankly abnormal. She had dark eyes, short-cropped black hair, and the kind of stillness that made junior officers either deeply reassured or deeply nervous, depending on their own temperament. She was also, as of 6 months ago, the commanding officer of humanity's most secret military program, Project Nightfall. "Run the diagnostic again," she said to Lieutenant Daniel Park, who was seated at the primary systems console to her left. Daniel was 29, Korean-American, brilliant in the specific way that theoretical physicists who had pivoted to applied military engineering tended to be brilliant, which meant he could explain extraordinarily complex concepts with perfect clarity, but sometimes forgot to eat for 36 hours if no one reminded him. He had been the lead systems engineer on Project Nightfall since its inception, and he had run this particular diagnostic approximately 400 times in the past 6 months, and he ran it again now without complaint because he understood why Maya kept asking. It was hard to believe, even when you'd built it yourself. "Nightfall field is nominal," Daniel said, reading from his console. "All 42 vessels reporting full field integrity. Light absorption rate is 99.997% across the entire spectrum. Gravity compensation is running within parameters. The fleet is effectively invisible to every known sensor technology in the Council database. And to technologies not in the Council database." Daniel glanced at her with a faint smile of someone who had already thought about this extensively. "We've tested against every detection methodology we could conceive of or extrapolate. We believe the answer is yes. But we won't know for certain until we're in theater." Maya nodded slowly. "And the weapon systems?" "Dark matter compression arrays are charged and ready on all 42 vessels. The Endless Horizon has primary firing solutions calculated for 40 different tactical scenarios. We can engage from inside the Nightfall field, which means we can fire without ever being detected. The energy discharge of the weapons themselves is absorbed by the field before it can propagate outward. He paused. To any external observer, a ship firing a dark matter compression round while inside a Nightfall field looks like nothing happened. Silence. And then whatever we were aiming at is just gone. The word gone sat in the air between them for a moment. How long can the field be maintained at full fleet scale? Maya asked. Indefinitely. The field is self-sustaining once established. It draws power from the dark matter interaction itself. Essentially, the more strongly the field absorbs electromagnetic radiation, the more energy it generates to maintain the field. It's a closed loop. The ships generate the field feeds the ships. Maya stared at the holographic display of the 42 dark shapes that were her fleet, invisible to every sensor in the galaxy except the specialized internal UEDF systems that they'd specifically engineered to work within a Nightfall field. 42 ships that, to the rest of the galaxy, did not exist. She thought about the 30 years since first contact, about the careful, exhausting, sometimes humiliating process of humanity's integration into a galactic community that was polite about it, but ultimately made very clear that humans were the newcomers. The youngest, the weakest, the least experienced, the ones who needed to sit quietly and listen and learn and follow the rules that everyone else had established long before humanity had figured out that other rules were even possible. She thought about the Council's reaction when UEDF had requested permission to establish a military research division. The polite amusement, the condescending reassurances that humanity didn't need its own military research because the Council's combined defense forces were more than adequate to protect all member species. The implication, never stated directly but always present, that humanity building its own weapons was a little bit like a child building a toy sword in a world where every adult carried a real one, charming, ultimately harmless, and not worth taking seriously. She thought about Dr. Lena Vasquez and what Lena had sacrificed to make this possible. She pushed that thought aside. There would be time for that later. Signal Commander Reeves, she said. Tell him we're ready. Daniel nodded and opened the channel. And 42 dark ships that no one in the galaxy could see moved toward the Selim sector. To understand what happened in the Council Chamber of the Stars, you need to understand what the 30 years between humanity's awakening and Project Nightfall had actually been like. Not the official story. Not the version in the UEDF press releases, or the Council's carefully curated welcome documents, or the enthusiastic news coverage that had characterized the first decade after first contact, when humanity was still intoxicated by the sheer impossible wonder of discovering that the galaxy was full of life. The real story. Commander James Reeves knew the real story better than almost anyone alive, because he had lived every chapter of it personally. He had been 11 years old when the Council ambassador arrived. He remembered it with the crystalline, overwhelming clarity that humans reserved for the most formative moments of their lives, the kind of memory that never faded, that you could return to decades later and still feel with the same physical intensity as the original moment. He had been sitting in his family's living room in Denver, Colorado, doing homework, when the emergency broadcast system cut into every screen on the planet simultaneously and showed the image of a Valorian spacecraft hovering in orbit above Earth, and the image of Ambassador Thessaly Vrun. Younger then, her silver skin a shade brighter, her 4 eyes wide with the careful warmth of someone who had done this 11 times before and knew exactly how overwhelming it was, explaining, in perfectly translated English and every other major human language simultaneously, that humanity was not alone and had never been alone, and that it was time to be welcomed into the community of the stars. James Reeves had sat in his family's living room for a long time after the broadcast ended, his homework forgotten, staring at a wall. And then he had decided, with the absolute certainty available only to 11-year-olds and certain rare adults who had not yet lost it, exactly what he was going to do with his life. He was going to be ready. For what, he hadn't fully known. But he was going to be ready for it. He had joined the UEDF the day he turned 18. By 25, he was a lieutenant commander. By 32, he was commanding his own vessel. By 37, he had been selected for a classified briefing that changed everything. But between 11 and 37, He had lived the 30 years of humanity's integration into the galactic community, and he had watched, with steadily increasing clarity, what that integration actually meant. It meant quotas. The Council's integration process included a series of restrictions on newly awakened civilizations, restrictions framed as protections, as guidance, as the reasonable precautions of a community that had learned hard lessons about what happened when new members were given too much freedom too quickly. Humanity was permitted to develop FTL travel, but only using Council-approved drive systems, which were sold to humanity at prices that consumed a significant fraction of Earth's combined economic output. Humanity was permitted to establish interstellar colonies, but only in regions designated by the Council, which were, by coincidence, resource-poor regions that established Council members had no interest in. Humanity was permitted to trade with other species, but subject to tariff structures that systematically disadvantaged human goods in favor of longer-established trading partners. And humanity was permitted to maintain a military, but with a cap on vessel size, weapons yield, and fleet numbers that were enforced through quarterly Council inspections. The cap was set through a formula that the Council's bureaucracy could explain in exhaustive detail and that everyone intuitively understood, at precisely the level that made human military forces adequate for internal security and completely inadequate for any kind of external threat response. Humanity was, in the most polite possible terms, contained. Most humans had no idea. The Council's integration framework was so thoroughly constructed, so graciously presented, so earnestly explained as being for humanity's own benefit, that the majority of Earth's 8 billion people thought the awakening was the greatest thing that had ever happened to their species. And in many ways, it was. The technology transfers alone had advanced human medicine, energy production, and environmental science by centuries. The galaxy was extraordinary. The other species were fascinating. The experience of knowing, truly knowing, with no more room for doubt, that the universe was alive and ancient and full of wonders was something that fundamentally changed how humanity understood itself. But Reeves had spent his career in the UEDF. He had sat in the meetings where the Council's quarterly inspection teams came aboard UEDF vessels with their scanners and their polite smiles and their long lists of specifications that couldn't be exceeded. He had watched those teams, Valorians mostly, occasionally a Keth or a Urine, move through UEDF ships with the comfortable ease of people who knew they were not going to find anything that surprised them. He had seen the way they looked at human technology with a kind of benign, slightly bored condescension. He had read the inspection reports, which invariably concluded that humanity's military development was proceeding within acceptable parameters, a phrase that he had come, over the years, to understand as meaning exactly what it implied. You're not getting out of the box we put you in, and we check regularly to make sure of it. He had also, over the years, quietly collected evidence of what the box was protecting. Not humanity, from the galaxy. The galaxy, specifically, the established powers of the galaxy, from humanity. Because the Council scientists had their own assessment of human potential. Not the assessment they shared with humanity. The classified one. The one that Reeves had obtained through 7 years of careful intelligence work, through a network of contacts he'd built across a dozen species, through trades and favors and the patient cultivation of relationships with beings who, unlike most of their colleagues, had looked at humanity and seen something that made them nervous. The classified assessment said this. Humans were anomalous. Biologically weak, yes. Technologically primitive by galactic standards, yes. Young, yes. But the human capacity for innovation, specifically the human approach to problem-solving under constraint, was unlike anything the Council had documented in any of the other 46 member species. Every other species in the Council had developed its technology in a roughly linear progression, building on established principles, refining known approaches, advancing steadily along predictable paths. Their technology was sophisticated, but it was coherent. It made sense. You could look at where they were and understand clearly how they had gotten there. Human technology, even the approved, restricted, carefully contained version, kept producing outputs that made no sense given the inputs the Council knew about. Humans took a set of known principles and somehow arrived at applications that no established civilization had conceived of. They had done it repeatedly, in fields ranging from medical nanobiotechnology to computational architecture to materials science. The Council's scientists had a word for it in a language Reeves had learned enough of to read their reports. The word translated roughly as uncontrolled recombination. An ability to connect things that weren't supposed to connect, to find applications that weren't supposed to exist, to build things from available materials that no one had thought to build. The classified assessment concluded, with what Reeves read as genuine anxiety leaking through the formal scientific language, that if humanity were ever given unrestricted access to the full spectrum of galactic scientific knowledge, the results were unpredictable in a way that the Council found deeply uncomfortable. That assessment was 22 years old. It had been updated 3 times since then. Each update was more anxious than the last. And none of the updates had been shared with humanity. Reeves had laid all of this in front of UEDF High Command 9 years ago, in a briefing room deep underground in the Swiss Alps, with full security protocols engaged and no recording systems running. He had presented his intelligence, made his argument, and watched the faces of the 12 people in the room, the 12 most senior military and scientific minds in the United Earth Defense Force, as they absorbed what he was telling them. There had been a long silence when he finished. And then General Patricia Walsh, 62 years old, 20 years from retirement, the most decorated military officer in UEDF history, had leaned forward and said, very quietly, "What do you propose?" Reeves had proposed Project Nightfall, and that was where Dr. Lena Vasquez came in. Lena Vasquez had been, by every measure available, the most brilliant physicist humanity had produced since first contact. She was 44 years old when Reeves recruited her for Project Nightfall, a small, intense woman with enormous dark eyes and the kind of mind that operated at a frequency most people could hear only dimly, like a sound at the edge of human hearing. You knew it was there, you could feel it, but you couldn't quite make it out. She had spent 20 years studying dark matter, not the theoretical dark matter of pre-contact physics, but the real thing, the actual dark matter that the Council's introductory science transfers had helped humanity finally measure and map and begin to understand. The Council scientists knew a great deal about dark matter. It constituted 27% of the universe's total energy content. It interacted gravitationally with normal matter. It did not emit, absorb, or reflect electromagnetic radiation of any kind. Beyond that, the Council's understanding was primarily mathematical. They could model dark matter's behavior, describe it, predict it. But they had never found a way to directly interact with it, to harness it, to use it as anything other than a gravitational reference point. Lena Vasquez had found a way. She had been quiet about it for 3 years. Working alone in a small facility in the Chilean Andes that officially did not exist, funded through channels so indirect that even UEDF High Command only knew the broad outlines, she had developed and refined and tested and revised her theories until she was sure, not hopeful, not optimistic, but rigorously, repeatably, scientifically sure, of 2 things. First, dark matter could be manipulated using a focused quantum coherence field, if the field was generated at precisely the right frequency and modulated in a specific pattern that she had spent 4 years calculating. Second, a vessel surrounded by a properly configured dark matter interaction field would, for all practical purposes, become electromagnetically invisible. Not because it was cloaked or shielded or hidden in any conventional sense, but because dark matter, by its fundamental nature, did not interact with electromagnetic radiation. A ship wrapped in a sufficiently dense dark matter field would simply sit outside the electromagnetic spectrum entirely. Light would not reach it, reflect off it, or bend around it. It would exist in a different layer of physical reality from the electromagnetic universe that every known detection system was built to observe. To sensor systems, it would be as if the ship were not there. To weapon systems designed to lock onto electromagnetic signatures, it would be untargetable. To communication intercept systems, it would be silent. It would be, in the most literal scientific sense, dark. Lena had brought her findings to Reeves with the careful calm of someone who had spent 3 years preparing themselves for the moment, and she had said, "I can make ships that the Council cannot see. But I need resources. Real resources. And I need the Council to not know what we're doing." Reeves had looked at her findings for 48 hours straight. He had brought in the 3 physicists on Earth he trusted most, and had them review Lena's work under total secrecy protocols. All 3 had come back with the same assessment. It was real. It worked. The math was sound, the experimental data was clean, and the implications were staggering. "What do you need?" he had asked Lena. She had given him a list. The list had taken 6 years to fulfill. 6 years of black budget funding, of materials acquired through channels that would not survive council scrutiny, of engineering teams working in facilities that officially did not exist on worlds that the council's inspection teams never visited. 6 years of 47 different cover stories, of misdirection and careful lies, and the exhausting constant work of maintaining a secret of this magnitude inside an organization that was regularly inspected by the very body they were hiding it from. And Lena had been there every step of the way, working 16-hour days, solving problem after problem, pushing the technology from theoretical to practical to refined to operational. She had driven herself with a focus that frightened even Reeves sometimes, a relentless, consuming dedication that he recognized as the specific kind of drive that comes not from ambition, but from conviction. Lena Vasquez did not want personal glory. She wanted humanity to be free. 3 months before Project Nightfall was ready to launch, Lena had been diagnosed with a neurodegenerative condition, a rare, aggressive disease that moved fast and left no room for negotiation. She had kept working. She had worked until the last possible moment, recording instructions, documenting processes, training the team that would maintain and operate the technology she had built. She had made Reeves promise, sitting in a medical facility in the Andes where the engineers had set up a workstation next to her bed, so she could keep going as long as her hands still cooperated, that he would use it well. "Don't just use it to scare them," she had said. Her voice had been thin by then, but her eyes were still sharp, still burning with that particular intensity. "Scare them, yes. But then talk to them. We don't want another arms race. We want a different table. A table where they see us as equals. That's what this is for." "I know," Reeves had said. "Promise me." "I promise, Lena." She had died 11 weeks later. Reeves had carried that promise into the council chamber of the stars, and he carried it right now, standing on the obsidian floor with 400 alien eyes staring down at him, and the chamber still ringing with the noise of 47 civilizations trying to process what they had just learned. He let them have their noise. He owed Lena Vasquez exactly the right next move. He was going to make sure it was worth what she had paid for it. In the Orbital Defense Command Center of the Valorian Home System, Admiral Kes Thorin had been watching the sensor feeds from the Selim sector for 9 hours straight without sleeping, eating, or doing anything except staring at the impossible data scrolling across his displays and trying to figure out what he was looking at. Kes Thorin was 112 years old, young for a Valorian, which meant he had only been a military commander for 40 of those years. He was tall, even by Valorian standards, with the silver-blue skin and the 4 luminous eyes that were characteristic of his species, and a mind that his peers described as one of the finest tactical intellects in the Council's combined military forces. He had won 3 major military engagements against genuinely formidable opponents. He had never once, in 40 years of command, encountered a situation that his training and experience and raw intelligence could not give him at least a framework for approaching. Until now. "Run the analysis again," he said to his sensor chief, a young Valorian named Mora who had been running the same analyses on loop for the past 4 hours and was doing an admirable job of not showing how much this was affecting her. "Admiral," Mora said carefully, "the analysis gives the same result every time. The readings are internally consistent. There is no sensor malfunction." "Then explain to me," Kes said, with the very controlled calm of a man who is extremely not calm, "what I am looking at." Mora pulled up the composite display. It showed the Selim sector, a region of space about 40 light-minutes across, with the Council's 412 vessel response fleet arrayed in defensive formation on one side. On the other side, the sensor display showed this as a series of ghostly gravity well outlines because that was the only thing the sensors could actually measure were the 42 human vessels. "What we can confirm," Mora said, keeping her voice professional, "is that there are 42 gravity wells of significant magnitude present in the sector. The smallest corresponds to a vessel mass of approximately 200 million metric tons. The largest corresponds to approximately 900 million metric tons. Kess stared at the numbers. For reference, the largest warship in the Council's combined fleet, the Keth Dreadnought Eternal Dominion, which had been considered the most powerful individual military vessel in the known galaxy for the past 300 years, massed 340 million metric tons. The largest human ship massed 900 million. And we cannot see them, he said. Not a question. A statement of something he was still, on some level, refusing to fully accept.
Correct.
Electromagnetic sensor returns across the full spectrum are zero. The vessels are not merely resistant to our scanning. They are, as far as our technology can determine, completely absent from the electromagnetic spectrum. It is as if the space they occupy simply does not interact with light. Mora paused. We have no framework for this. I've checked the entire Council's science database. There is no documented phenomenon that produces this result. And our weapons? Mora's expression, which had been professionally neutral, slipped slightly. Admiral, our targeting systems require an electromagnetic lock to engage. We cannot target what we cannot see electromagnetically. We can calculate the approximate location of each vessel based on its gravitational signature, but the precision required for weapons targeting is many orders of magnitude greater than what gravity well mapping can provide. We could fire weapons at the general region occupied by a vessel. We would be firing blind. Kess thought about the other thing his analysts had reported. The thing they'd found when they studied the gravity well signatures of the human fleet in closer detail. The weapon signatures, he said. Mora hesitated. Yes. Tell me again. The energy readings we've detected from within the human fleet's position suggest weapon systems based on dark matter compression technology. She said this the way a person says something they have checked 4 times and still cannot fully believe. If our analysis is correct, and I want to be clear that we're working from indirect inference, not direct measurement, then the human vessels are armed with weapons that fire compressed dark matter projectiles. Dark matter rounds would be, like the Nightfall field itself, electromagnetically invisible. They would also be effectively immune to any known energy shielding technology, because energy shields interact with electromagnetic phenomena and dark matter is not an electromagnetic phenomenon. A dark matter round would pass directly through conventional shielding as if it were not there. Silence in the command center. So, Kess said very slowly, they are invisible to our sensors. Our weapons cannot lock onto them. And if they chose to fire on our fleet, their weapons would pass through our shields. That is what the data suggests, Admiral. Another silence. And then, from the communications console across the room, a junior officer said in a voice that was working very hard to sound steady, Admiral, the human commander is asking again if we'd like to send a representative to speak with him. He says, and I quote, that he's happy to wait, but perhaps the Council would find it more comfortable to have this conversation inside, where everyone can sit down. Kess stared at the communications officer for a long moment. Then he stared at his sensor displays again, at the 42 ghost shapes that he couldn't see, couldn't target, and couldn't stop. Then he closed his 4 eyes briefly, opened them, and said, Tell Commander Reeves that we accept his invitation. And then get me Ambassador Vrun on a secure channel. He was going to need 46 more ambassadors before this day was done. 3 hours after Commander Reeves had made his opening statement to the Council of the Stars, the chamber had still not achieved anything resembling productive order, and Grand Speaker Olu Han, a Uran elder who had presided over the council for 40 years and who had, in that time, guided the chamber through some of the most volatile diplomatic confrontations in recent galactic history, was running out of patience. Grand Speaker Han communicated through the bioluminescent patterns of his skin, which the chamber's translation system rendered as a deep, resonant baritone. Right now, his skin was cycling through patterns that translated as order. This chamber will come to order now. It was working slowly. The noise was subsiding into a charged, crackling near silence, the way a storm subsides without quite ending. Representatives were still leaning toward each other, still exchanging urgent whispered communications, still doing the interspecies equivalent of turning to the person next to them and saying, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Reeves stood in the center of the floor and waited with the patience of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 9 years and was not going to waste it by being impatient. When the chamber was quiet enough, Grand Speaker Han's translation system said, "The Council acknowledges Commander Reeves of the United Earth Defense Force. Commander Reeves has stated that he has a proposal for the Council. Before we hear this proposal, the Council has questions." "Of course," Reeves said. "I'm at the Council's disposal." Ambassador Graxis of the Keth, massive, six-limbed, with the dark exoskeletal plating that made Keth look simultaneously ancient and dangerous, was the first to speak. The Keth were the oldest members of the Council, their civilization predating even the Valorians by 3,000 years, and Graxis spoke with the particular authority of someone who had never, in his very long life, encountered a situation in which he was not the most powerful entity in the room. "Until today." "Human," he said, and the translation rendered his voice as something between a grinding of stone and a deep bass note. "You have brought military vessels into Council-restricted space without authorization. You have demonstrated weapons technology that violates every provision of the new member Military Development Accord that your species signed 30 years ago. And you are standing here, as though you have done nothing wrong. Explain yourself." Reeves met the ambassador's multiple eyes without flinching. "Ambassador Graxis, with respect, and I mean that genuinely, the new member Military Development Accord governs conventional weapons development. What we've built is not conventional. The Accord specifies limits on vessel mass, conventional weapons yield, and fleet numbers. We have complied with those limits for every vessel and weapon system we've reported to Council inspectors." A pause that contained the precise weight of the word "reported." "The Nightfall fleet was developed outside the Accord framework," Reeves continued, "because the Accord framework does not address dark matter technology. There is no provision in the Accord relating to dark matter weapons or dark matter field generation because, at the time the Accord was written, no member species had this technology. We did not violate the Accord. We found the space between the words." The chamber erupted again. Reeves waited. From the Drovani delegation, a shifting cloud of reddish gas that occupied a specially sealed section of the chamber, came a sound like pressure releasing. The translation system rendered it as, "The human is claiming a legal technicality to justify an act of military deception." "Not deception," Reeves said clearly, when the noise permitted him to be heard. "Privacy. Humanity has the same right to develop proprietary technology as any other member species. When Valorian engineers developed the fold space drive 200 years ago, they did not share their research with the Council while they were developing it. When the Keth built the Eternal Dominion, the specifications were Keth military property for 50 years before they were disclosed. We have simply exercised the same right. We built something privately. And now we are disclosing it." Another wave of noise. This time Reeves caught, in the undercurrent of the sound, something interesting. Not just anger. Not just shock. Calculation. Some of those voices were already thinking about what this meant for them specifically. What it meant for the balance of power they had spent centuries carefully maintaining. What it meant that the species they had all, to varying degrees, treated as the weakest player at the table had just flipped the table. He had expected that. He had planned for it. Ambassador Thessaly Vrun had been very quiet since the chamber erupted. Now she spoke for the first time, and the authority in her voice, 60 years of diplomatic experience, the Valorian reputation for measured rationality, the simple force of her presence, brought the chamber down to a listening silence faster than the Grand Speaker's repeated calls for order. "Commander Reeves," she said, "you told the Council you have a proposal. I suggest we hear it." Reeves had always respected Thessaly Vrun. Even when she was the face of the system that had contained humanity, he had respected her. She was not cruel. She was not cynical. She genuinely believed that what the Council did was right and necessary. That made her, in some ways, harder to deal with than someone who knew they were wrong, but it also meant she was capable of being genuinely moved by a good argument. He hoped she was going to be moved today. "Thank you, Ambassador Vrun," he said. "My proposal is simple. Humanity is not here to threaten the Council. We are not here to demand territory or resources or political concessions. We are not here to overturn the Council's authority or dissolve the agreements that govern this community. He paused. We are here to renegotiate our place in it. The silence that followed this was a different quality from the stunned silence at the beginning. This was a listening silence, an assessing silence. For 30 years, Reeves continued, humanity has been a member of the Council in name while being treated as a subject in practice. Our development has been managed, our territory allocated, our military capacity deliberately constrained. This has been done, we understand, with the sincere belief that it was for our own good and for the stability of the community. We don't believe those intentions were malicious. We believe they were misguided. He let that settle. We are not the species we were 30 years ago. We are not the species your classified assessment files have predicted us to be at this stage of development. He saw the ripple that moved through the chamber at that, the slight shifts, the exchanges of glances, the reaction of beings who had not expected a junior member species to know about the classified assessment files. We are something your models did not account for. And we have demonstrated that today, out there in the Sealam sector, with 42 ships that your combined military forces cannot target, detect, or engage. He looked directly at Ambassador Vrun. So here is humanity's proposal, simply stated. We want to renegotiate the new member accord. We want territory that reflects our actual contribution to this community rather than our assessed value as new arrivals. We want trade terms that are genuinely reciprocal. We want a seat on the Council's Security Committee, which currently does not include any species whose awakening happened in the last 1,000 years. And we want the quarterly military inspections to end. The noise that followed this was enormous. Reeves stood in the center of it and waited. He had more to say. The most important part was still to come. But he had learned, in 9 years of planning for this moment, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could say was nothing at all, while the people you were talking to processed the thing you had already said. He waited. And in the upper tier of the chamber, Ambassador Thessaly Vrun sat very still and thought about what she was looking at, and realized, with the slow, humbling recognition of someone who had been wrong about something important for a very long time, that she had misjudged humanity entirely. While Commander Reeves was speaking to the Council, Captain Maya Chen was doing what she had spent 9 years learning to do. Waiting. The endless horizon floated at the center of the Nightfall fleet's formation, its dark matter field running at full integrity. Invisible to every sensor, the Council response fleet across the sector was still, even now, training on their general position. Maya sat in the command chair with her eyes on the displays and her mind moving through every contingency she had identified, every potential action the Council might take, every variable she had prepared a response for. She had been doing this for so long that it had stopped feeling like planning and started feeling like conversation. Like she was in a constant, ongoing dialogue with a future that hadn't happened yet. Lieutenant Daniel Park was at his console, monitoring the fleet systems with the focused, slightly faraway attention of a person listening to music that no one else can hear. Around them, the command bay of the endless horizon hummed with the quiet work of 30 people who were very good at their jobs and who understood, with a clarity that most of them had needed several weeks to fully achieve, exactly how historic this moment was. The Council Response Fleet is still at battle stations, reported Lieutenant Commander Aisha Okonkwo from the tactical console. She was 35, Nigerian-British, with the kind of tactical precision that came from growing up in a household where her mother was a military strategist and her father was a theoretical mathematician, and she had absorbed both disciplines until they became something singular and distinctly her own. They've reconfigured their formation twice in the past hour. I think they're trying to cover the angles they're most worried about. Which angles? Maya asked. Aisha studied her display. They're concentrating their heaviest vessels on the approach vectors toward the Council chamber relay stations and the Valorian home system. They're protecting communication infrastructure and the political center. She paused. They're not forming up for offensive action. They're forming up for defense. Maya nodded. They're scared. They're protecting what they care about most. Should I be worried about that? Asked Ensign Tom Bradley from the navigation console. He was 24, the youngest officer on the bridge, and he had the admirable quality of asking the questions that more senior officers sometimes didn't ask because they were worried about appearing uncertain. No, Maya said. A fleet in defensive posture is a fleet that's been told not to start a fight. That's what we want. She glanced at Daniel. What's our window looking like? Daniel pulled up a timeline display. Reeves has been on the floor for about 40 minutes. Based on our modeling of how council deliberations typically go, we estimated 2 to 4 hours for the initial reaction phase, then a request for recess, then either a counterproposal or a request for more time. We're inside the expected window. And if they skip straight to a vote to expel humanity from the council, then we trigger contingency 4, Maya said calmly. We don't want that, but we're ready for it. Contingency 4 was the one that nobody on the bridge liked thinking about. It didn't involve firing a single weapon. It involved something that Reeves had quietly described as making the point in a way that doesn't require anyone to get hurt. Specifically, it involved using the Endless Horizon's dark matter field in a way that Lena Vasquez had built into the system as a demonstration mode, a way to show, without firing a shot, what the dark matter compression array could do. Lena had designed the demonstration mode with a scientist's characteristic precision about what it would and would not destroy. Maya hoped they didn't need it. Commander Reeves is holding the floor well, said Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka from the communications console. She was monitoring the open channel from the council chamber. Reeves had arranged for the entire session to be broadcast to the Endless Horizon in real time. The council is loud, but they're listening.
He's good at that, Maya said.
Making people listen when they don't want to. She thought about the first time she'd met Reeves, 9 years ago in the underground briefing room in the Alps. He had been the one who had come to her with the offer, not the other way around. She had already known in a general way that there was classified research happening. She was UEDF, she'd been decorated twice, she had clearances that most people didn't know existed. She had her suspicions. But Reeves had sat across from her in that cold underground room and had laid out the entire picture with a clarity and a completeness that had genuinely taken her breath away. Not because of the politics, though the politics were infuriating. Not because of the intelligence files, though they were damning. But because of the vision. Not a vision of conflict. A vision of equality. We are not doing this to go to war with the council, he had said. We are doing this so that we never have to. So that when humanity comes to the table, it comes as a partner, an equal, not a student, not a charity case, not a contained liability, a partner. Maya had said yes before he finished explaining what the job was. She was glad, on days like today, that she had. Captain, Aisha said from Tactical. The Council Response Fleet is standing down from battle stations. They're moving to Standard Alert. Someone told them to stop looking like they're about to fight. Maya allowed herself a single, quiet exhale.
Good, she said.
That means the conversation is happening. Keep monitoring. And someone get me a coffee. The last sentence broke the tension on the bridge, like a stone through glass. 3 people laughed. Tom Bradley was already moving toward the galley before she'd finished the sentence. Maya kept her eyes on her displays and let herself think, for just a moment, about Lena. About what this would have meant to her. She looked at her dark displays, at the readouts that showed 42 invisible ships holding their positions in the Selam sector, and she thought, we did it, Lena. We got to the table. Now she just had to make sure Reeves got them a seat at it. Ambassador Thessaly Vrun had requested a recess. The council had granted it, somewhat frantically, in the manner of a body that desperately needed time to think, and now the chamber was in a 2-hour break while every delegation retreated to their private suites to communicate urgently with their home governments, argue with each other, run tactical analyses, take medication for species-specific stress responses, and generally try to figure out what the correct next move was. Thessaly had retreated to her private chamber, a small, elegantly appointed room adjacent to the main council hall, furnished in the precise shades of blue-gray that Valorians found mentally calming, and she was sitting in perfect stillness with her 4 eyes closed, doing something that Valorian culture called deep accounting, which was a meditative practice for processing information overload that roughly translated to sorting through everything you know and everything you feel until you can tell the difference between them. She had a great deal of both to sort through. What she knew, humanity had developed technology that the Council had not anticipated, had not prepared for, and currently had no counter to. The Nightfall fleet was real, was operational, and was 42 ships strong. If the intelligence the Council's analysts had spent the past 6 hours frantically compiling was accurate, the dark matter compression weapons were as effective as Reeves's presentation implied. Humanity had, in the space of a single morning, gone from being the Council's most junior and least militarily significant member to being, at minimum, one of the 5 most formidable military powers in the known galaxy. At minimum, because Thessaly had been asking herself, since the moment Reeves had walked into the chamber, a question that she suspected the other ambassadors hadn't thought of yet, because they were too busy being alarmed about what they had already seen. The question was, how long had they been building this? Reeves had said 6 years for the fleet itself, but the research must have preceded that. And the infrastructure to build 42 ships of that scale, while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of a UEDF that was well within Council inspection parameters, was itself an extraordinary achievement. You didn't build a shadow program of that complexity in 6 years. The foundations must have been laid for much longer, which meant humanity had been planning this, quietly, patiently, without a single detectable hint, for at least a decade, possibly longer. And they had done it without the Council knowing, which meant either their intelligence services had a gap the size of a Keth dreadnought that they hadn't known about, or humanity had concealed this with a thoroughness and discipline that should not, by every behavioral model the Council had of newly awakened species, have been possible. The Council's model of humanity was built on the observation that humans were emotionally expressive, individually driven, politically fractious, and generally poor at keeping secrets at an institutional level. Human governments leaked information constantly. Human scientists published research eagerly. Human military personnel were, compared to Keth or Valorian equivalents, relatively easy to read through behavioral analysis. And yet, a 10-year, multi-billion credit, galaxy-changing secret.
Kept perfectly.
Thessaly opened her eyes and looked at the wall of her private chamber and thought about what that actually meant. Not as a political problem, as a question of understanding. What kind of species keeps that kind of secret? What motivation, what degree of collective conviction drives that level of coordinated deception across an entire organization, maintained for a decade? She thought about what Reeves had said. We are not the species we were 30 years ago. She thought about what she knew of human history, the history before the Awakening, the 30,000 years of it that the Council's cultural analysts had studied during the integration process. A history of extraordinary violence and extraordinary creativity, of civilizations rising and falling, of species-wide catastrophes survived through what could only be described as sheer, bloody-minded refusal to accept extinction. A history of beings who, when put in a corner, did not accept the corner. She thought about what the Council had done, what she had participated in, with the sincere belief that it was right and necessary. The quotas, the territory allocation, the inspection regime, the careful, benevolent management of humanity's development, designed to prevent them from becoming a destabilizing force in the galactic community before they had the maturity to handle power responsibly. She thought about what it had felt like, from the inside, to be told, with great politeness, that you were not ready. To be given carefully restricted access to a community you had been told was your community. To be inspected and managed and contained. For 30 years. She closed her 4 eyes again. And she thought, if that had been done to Valorians, if, in the Valorian awakening 11,000 years ago, some greater power had looked at her ancestors and decided they needed to be managed, would Valorians have accepted it? Would they have been patient and cooperative and diplomatic about it for 30 years? Or would they have done something much more like what humanity had just done? She knew the answer. She had always known the answer. She just hadn't asked herself the question the right way before. When the recess ended and the Council chamber reconvened, Thessaly Vrun stood up before anyone else could speak, and she did something she had not done in 40 years as an ambassador. She asked to speak in support of a proposal rather than in deliberation of it. Ambassadors, she said, and the chamber went very quiet, because Thessaly Vrun speaking in support of anything without extensive deliberation was so extraordinary that the room responded to it the way a room responds to something they've never seen before. I want to say something before we vote. She looked down at Commander Reeves, who was watching her with those calm brown eyes. I want to say that I think we were wrong. The chamber held its breath. We constructed the new member accord with the best of intentions, she continued. I believed that it was protection, that it was wisdom, that we had the right to decide when a new species was ready to be treated as our equal, and that exercising that right was an act of responsibility. She paused. We told ourselves a story about guardianship. And in that story, we were the guardians and the humans were in our care. She looked around at the 46 other delegations. But guardianship that the guarded did not consent to and cannot escape, and have no voice in determining the terms of, that is not guardianship. And I think we have always known this. We simply found it more comfortable not to say it. She looked back at Reeves. Commander Reeves, humanity has demonstrated, beyond any possibility of doubt, that you are not children who need managing. You are a civilization that built, in secret, technology that none of us in this chamber were capable of building, and that renders every military calculation we have made about galactic security obsolete.
She paused.
I would like to be very honest with you. That is frightening. I believe I speak for every member of this council when I say that what you showed us today was deeply, genuinely frightening. Reeves said nothing, waiting. But Thessaly said, I also think it is something else. I think it is an invitation. You could have done many things with 42 invisible warships and dark matter weapons that pass through energy shielding. You chose to come here and ask for a seat at the table. She looked at him steadily. I believe that choice matters more than the ships. The chamber was absolutely still. I will be voting yes to open renegotiation of the new member accord, Thessaly said. And I am asking my colleagues to do the same. She sat down. And Commander James Reeves, standing alone on the obsidian floor, looked up at her and said very quietly, Thank you, Ambassador. Not everyone in the council chamber felt the way Thessaly Vrun felt. Ambassador Graxis of the Keth had been listening to Vrun's speech with the controlled stillness of a species that had long ago mastered the art of not showing their emotions to potential adversaries, a mastery born of 11,000 years of being the most powerful civilization in the galaxy and understanding that the powerful, if they are wise, do not gloat. Keth did not gloat.
Keth planned.
And Graxis, while Vrun was speaking her eloquent and, he thought, dangerously naive words about humanity and tables and consent, was already several steps ahead. The Keth delegation's private communication channel, a frequency that the council systems technically permitted but practically never monitored, because the Keth had been members since the council's founding and the founders were by tradition assumed to be acting in good faith, was buzzing with the rapid-fire exchange of the 6 other Keth ambassadors who formed his full delegation team. They cannot be allowed to sit on the security committee, said Second Ambassador Vreth, whose specialty was military policy and who sounded about as alarmed as a Keth ever allowed themselves to sound. The Security Committee determines defense posture for the entire Council collective. If humanity has a vote on Security Committee decisions, and humanity possesses technology that the committee cannot counter, then humanity effectively controls the Security Committee's decisions, Graxis finished.
Yes.
I understand. We should vote no, Vreth said. We will vote no, Graxis said. The question is whether it matters. He looked around the chamber at the body language, or equivalent, for species whose bodies communicated differently, of his fellow ambassadors. He was reading the room with the practiced eye of someone who had read rooms for 300 years, and what he was reading made him uncomfortable. Vrun had moved the middle. He could see it. The delegations that had been undecided, the Miran, the Tessovi, the Braun, were leaning differently than they had been before her speech. The ones that had been cautiously open to negotiation were now clearly moving toward yes. Even the Drovani, who were traditionally the most politically conservative bloc in the council, were cycling through colors that their translation system was marking as reconsidering. He was going to lose this vote. He had lost votes before. That was not, in itself, unusual. What was unusual was the reason he was going to lose it and the implications of the loss. They've made us afraid, he said, speaking to his delegation but partly to himself. Vrun dressed it up in language about consent and equality, but the real reason this chamber is going to vote yes is that those 42 ships are still sitting out there in the Sealam sector, and no one in this chamber can stop them from doing whatever they want. Then we have already lost the negotiation, Vreth said. If we're voting from fear, we have lost the opening position, Graxus corrected. The negotiation itself is a different matter. The human said he wanted to renegotiate the accord. He didn't specify every term. There is still a great deal of space between opening the renegotiation and completing it. And in that space, he stopped, because something had just changed. The Council's internal alert system, a quiet but unmistakable tone that the chamber's systems use to flag urgent incoming intelligence, had just sounded.
Twice.
On the main display screen that occupied the wall behind the Grand Speaker's position, new information was appearing. It was coming from the UEDF, from Commander Reeves specifically. He had just submitted, through official council channels, a document. The document was titled, UEDF Project Nightfall, Full Technical Disclosure. Complete technical specifications. Every detail of the dark matter field generation technology. Every component of the dark matter compression weapon systems. The full scientific foundation that Lena Vasquez had built. The engineering processes. The manufacturing protocols. Everything that 42 invisible warships had demonstrated was possible. Given freely. To the Council. To all 47 member species. The chamber went still in the way that spaces go still when something happens that no one was expecting and everyone is trying to work out what it means. Reeves spoke into the silence. The technology is yours, he said simply. All of it. We're not keeping it. We're not trading it. We're giving it to every member of the Council, without conditions. The research, the specifications, the manufacturing protocols, everything you need to build your own Nightfall systems. He paused. We want this technology to be a foundation for galactic security that every species shares, not a weapon that one species holds over the others. Another pause. That's who humanity is, he said. We built something extraordinary. And our first instinct was to share it. We wanted you to know that before the vote. Ambassador Graxus sat very still. He was revising his calculations at a speed that was making his primary neural complex ache. He had expected the humans to use the technology as leverage, to extract concessions under the implicit threat of what those warships could do. That was what power did. That was what every powerful civilization in the Council had done when they held a decisive advantage. They converted it into political and economic gains before the advantage eroded. They did not give it away. He thought about the classified assessment files that Reeves had mentioned knowing about. The ones that described human innovation as uncontrolled recombination. The ones that the Council scientists had updated 3 times with increasing anxiety. He thought that perhaps the Council scientists had been anxious about the wrong thing. It wasn't humanity's capacity to produce unexpected technology that should have frightened them. It was humanity's capacity to do completely unexpected things with power once they had it. He had never, in 300 years of political life, seen a civilization with a decisive military advantage simply give it away. He sat very still for a long time, and then slowly he changed his vote. While the Council was processing Commander Reeves's disclosure, Captain Maya Chun on the endless horizon was dealing with a problem she had not anticipated. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka, had flagged something unusual in the passive sensor feeds, not unusual in a threatening way, but unusual in a way that required attention. Captain, Yuki said carefully, I'm picking up a communications signal that's not going through any of the Council's official channels. It's encrypted. Very heavily encrypted. Maya was at her side in 3 steps. Source? It's coming from inside the Council response fleet. Specifically, from one of the Keth vessels. Maya looked at the signal data. The encryption was extraordinary, the kind of layering that took significant computational resources and significant motivation. Can we break it? Not in real time. But I've captured the full transmission. I can work on it. Yuki paused. Captain, there's something else. The signal is directional. It's pointed away from the Council chamber. Away from the Sealam sector. It's pointed toward the outer edge of the system. Maya felt something she rarely felt in tactical situations, a cold, precise spike of concern. Someone's calling for help from outside the system? That's what it looks like. Yuki was already running decryption algorithms. If the Keth are contacting an external force, then we might have company coming, Maya said. She straightened and looked at the tactical display. Aisha, what's our long-range sensor picture? Aisha Okonkwo was already on it. Running now. Long-range arrays are clear. Nothing inbound on any of the standard approach vectors. She was quiet for a moment.
Wait.
Captain, I'm getting something anomalous on the gravity wave detectors. Very faint. At extreme range. Direction. Outer rim. Beyond the Council response fleet's position. Another pause. If I'm reading this correctly, and I want to be clear that at this range, the margin of error is significant. There are multiple gravity wells approaching. Moving fast. FTL range velocities. The bridge was very quiet. How many? Maya asked. Aisha looked at her display. Then she looked at Maya. More than 42. Maya held the implications of that for exactly 3 seconds. Signal Commander Reeves, she said. Secure channel. Tell him we may have a development. Captain, Tom Bradley said from navigation, if there's an inbound fleet, then we deal with it. Maya said calmly. That's what the Nightfall field is for, Tom. We're invisible. Whatever's coming, they can't target us. She looked at Daniel Park. Can they? Daniel was running calculations. If it's standard council technology, no. Not unless they've developed something we don't know about. He paused. But if the Keth called them in, and if whoever they called has been specifically briefed on our detection methodology. Someone's trying to catch us in a trap, Aisha said quietly. Maya looked at the main display. The 42 ghost shapes of her fleet. The Council response fleet ahead. And somewhere beyond the range of reliable sensor data, something coming. Here's what we know, she said, making her voice very clear and very steady, because in moments like this, the people around her needed clarity more than anything else. We know our technology works. We know we're invisible. We know that dark matter compression weapons are not deterrable by any energy shielding in the Council's arsenal. We know the Nightfall field is self-sustaining and cannot be disrupted by any known means.
She paused.
And we know that Commander Reeves is in that chamber right now doing the most important thing, which is the thing we built all of this for. We are not going to panic. We are not going to act without orders. And we are not going to do anything that turns this diplomatic moment into a military one. She looked around the bridge. Clear? Clear, said 14 voices in unison. Good. Yuki, keep working on that decryption. Aisha, track whatever's coming and give me an ETA as soon as you can calculate it. Daniel, I want full weapons readiness, but nothing powered up. Stay cold. She sat back in her command chair. And someone bring me another coffee. It's going to be a long day. But her eyes, behind the calm, were doing their own calculations. Because there was something else. Something she hadn't said to her crew. Because saying it out loud would make it more real, and she needed to think it through before it was real. The Keth had been first at almost everything in the Council's history. First to develop FTL travel. First to establish an interstellar empire. First to build a Dreadnought-class warship. 300 years ago, when the Keth Eternal Dominion had been commissioned, it had been the largest warship ever constructed in the known galaxy.
Until today.
But what Keth history also recorded, and what Maya had studied extensively because she was the kind of person who studied things extensively, was that the Keth had never achieved the Eternal Dominion in isolation. The Keth did not build in isolation. They built through acquisition, through trade, through treaty, through alliance, through the accumulated borrowing of the best available technology from every civilization they had ever encountered. The Keth were the greatest synthesizers in the galaxy. Which meant that if a Keth military vessel was calling for external reinforcement right now, it was not calling for a standard Keth battle fleet. It was calling for something that Keth military intelligence had already prepared specifically for this scenario. Something built from acquired components. Something designed for this exact contingency. Which meant someone had anticipated this. Which meant Project Nightfall had a leak. Maya pulled up the personnel files for Project Nightfall. Not the current crew of the Endless Horizon. The historical files. Everyone who had ever been read into the project at any level. Engineers,
Scientists.
support staff, security personnel. There were 942 names.
She stared at the list.
And she started thinking. The ships that had responded to the Keth's encrypted call dropped out of FTL 45 minutes later, at the outer edge of the Selam sector, and even through the cold lens of professional military assessment, Captain Mayachin had to admit that they were impressive. There were 63 of them. They were not standard Council fleet vessels. They were larger, heavier, more angular, built with an aggressive geometry that communicated purpose very clearly. And they were equipped with something that Maya's sensors identified with a jolt of adrenaline that she immediately suppressed: modified gravitational wave detectors. Purpose-built. Specialized. The kind that would not have existed in any Council arsenal 36 hours ago, because no one in the Council had known to build them. Someone had anticipated the Nightfall field. Not completely. The gravitational detectors were clearly improvised, a fast-build solution rather than a refined technology. But they were there. And they were searching the sector in overlapping sweeps, trying to map the gravity wells of her fleet with enough precision to generate targeting solutions. They're getting approximate positions, Aisha said from tactical, her voice very controlled. Not good enough for weapons lock yet. But if they keep refining. How long? Maya asked. 40 minutes to an hour before they have targeting precision good enough for area effect weapons. They may not be able to hit us precisely, but they can flood our position with enough ordnance that precise targeting becomes irrelevant. Area effect weapons. Weapons that didn't need to target a specific ship, they just needed to fill the region of space the ship occupied with sufficient destructive force that survival became a question of probability rather than countermeasures. That's the counter, Daniel said, his voice thoughtful rather than frightened. He was processing the tactical situation with the same analytical detachment he brought to any problem. If you can't see us and can't lock on, you saturate the area. It's not elegant, but against a large fleet in a defined sector of space. It's not useless, Maya finished. She looked at the tactical display. 63 purpose-built vessels equipped with gravitational detectors, moving to surround the Nightfall fleet's position. Someone thought this through. Captain, Yuki said from communications, I've broken the encryption on that Keth signal. Every head on the bridge turned toward her. Yuki's expression was complicated. The signal was sent 12 hours before our fleet arrived in the Selam sector. Before we even began our transit here. Silence on the bridge. They knew we were coming, Aisha said. Not just coming, Yuki said. They knew what we were. The message contains a technical brief on the Nightfall field. Not complete, there are significant gaps, but enough to know what to look for and enough to commission the gravitational detectors. She paused. The message was sent by someone inside Project Nightfall. Maya stared at the decrypted message on Yuki's console. 942 names on the personnel list. And one of them had told the Keth everything. But also, 12 hours before their arrival. Which meant the leak had happened before the fleet even left its staging area. Which meant the Keth had known, and had chosen to let the fleet arrive anyway. Had let Reeves walk into the council chamber. Had let the disclosure happen.
Why?
She thought about it for 30 seconds, pulling at the threads. Because blocking the fleet would have been obvious. Because if the Keth had intercepted the Nightfall fleet before it reached the council, humanity would have known they were compromised, would have responded differently, would not have walked into the chamber and disclosed everything. The Keth had let the disclosure happen. Had let Reeves hand over the technology. And now they were here with 63 ships and gravitational detectors, trying to pin down the Nightfall fleet's position in the Selam sector. Because they already had the technology. Because the incomplete technical brief, plus, soon, the full disclosure that Reeves had just made to the entire council, meant the Keth now had everything they needed to build their own Nightfall fleet. And if the Keth built a Nightfall fleet before humanity's renegotiated position in the council was secured, the entire leverage equation changed completely. Maya picked up the secure channel to the council chamber.
Commander Reeves, she said.
We have a problem. Commander Reeves received Maya's call in the council chamber during the deliberation recess that followed his technology disclosure. He stepped into a private anteroom adjacent to the main hall, his expression giving nothing away, and listened to Maya's briefing with the absolute focus of someone hearing exactly the kind of development they had hoped would not happen. "The leak," he said when she finished. "Yes, sir." "Do you have a name?"
Not yet.
"Yuki's working on it. But based on the technical content of the message, the specific gaps in what they knew, I can narrow it. The information in that leak corresponds to access level 7 or above, with specific knowledge of the field generation systems but limited knowledge of the weapons integration. That puts it inside a team of about 40 people." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "I have a name," he said. Maya was very still on the other end of the channel. "Dr. Marcus Webb," Reeves said. "Senior engineering consultant. He was read into the program at year 3. He had access level 8. He was assigned specifically to field generation systems." He paused. "He was also, until 2 years ago, in a relationship with a Keth cultural attaché named Shara Graxis." "Graxis," Maya said. "As in Ambassador Graxis." "Ambassador Graxis's cousin," Reeves said.
Yes.
The relationship was disclosed and assessed as low risk at the time. Marcus was genuinely in love. We monitored for 18 months and saw nothing that raised concerns. When he transferred to a different facility, the relationship ended. We were told it ended mutually, and we accepted that." His voice was very controlled, very measured. "We should not have accepted it." Maya thought about a man who had genuinely loved someone and had perhaps been genuinely loved in return, and about how love was one of the things that intelligence operations found hardest to account for, not because love was unpredictable, but because it was too predictable. Predictable in ways that were easy to miss when you were looking for obvious threats. "Was he coerced?" she asked. "Or did he choose to tell them?" "I don't know yet." Reeves was quiet for a second. "It matters." "It does," Maya agreed. Because it was one thing if Marcus Webb had been pressured or threatened or manipulated into revealing classified information. That was a tragedy and a security failure, and it demanded a response. But it was a response that belonged in the category of harm done. And it was another thing entirely if he had made a choice, had weighed his conscience against his country, and decided that humanity's hidden agenda deserved to be exposed. That was still a security failure, but it was a failure that deserved a harder question. A question about whether the thing being hidden was something that should have been. Reeves seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "Whatever his reasons," Reeves said, "the tactical situation is what it is. The Keth have the technology. They have 63 ships trying to pin down our fleet. And I'm in the middle of a council session where I've just given away everything we built." He paused. "Captain Chen, what do you need from me?" "Permission to maneuver," she said. "If we stay static, they'll eventually refine their gravitational mapping enough to generate area effect firing solutions. But if we move, they lose their map," Reeves said. "And they have to start over." "Yes, sir. Our Nightfall field is mobile. Their detectors have to recalibrate every time we move. If we keep moving, they can't get a lock."
Exactly.
"But here's what I need you to understand before I do it. Movement generates gravitational signatures. If I move 42 ships inside this sector, the 63 inbound vessels will see it.
They'll know we know about them."
Right now, they may still believe they have surprise on their side. "Do you want surprise on your side?" Reeves asked. "Or do you want them to know you know?" Maya thought about it for exactly 5 seconds. "I want them to know," she said. "If they think they have surprise, they'll push. If they know we're aware and moving, they have to reconsider. It buys time." "Then move," Reeves said. "And Captain, do not fire unless fired upon. Not a single shot." "Understood." "One more thing," Reeves said. "The Council needs to know about those 63 ships. The fact that they're here, that they came from a Keth encrypted call, that they have a partial technical brief on our technology that suggests a leak from inside our program. All of that goes on the official record of this session.
Today.
While we're still in chamber." Maya understood immediately. Because if you wait, the Keth can claim it was a defensive response. But if you put it on the record now, in the middle of the renegotiation, then it becomes part of the renegotiation, Reeves said. Ambassador Graxis just had his cousin compromise a classified human military program. That changes his position at the table significantly. And if his delegation knows we know, then they know the cost of trying to undercut us just went up, Reeves said simply.
Go.
Keep our people safe. I'll handle the chamber. In the chamber, Reeves waited for the recess to end, and when the council reconvened, he stood on the obsidian floor and said, Ambassadors, before deliberations continue, I need to make the council aware of a development. He stated the facts clearly. The encrypted transmission from the Keth vessel, the 63-ship fleet now in the Sealam sector, the gravitational detectors that should not exist yet unless someone had advanced intelligence on the Nightfall technology, the partial technical brief, its content, and the access level it required. He did not mention Marcus Webb's name. That was not the council's concern, and it was not a wound to be opened in this room. He did not accuse Ambassador Graxis directly. He stated facts and allowed the chamber to draw its own conclusions. He watched Ambassador Graxis during the entire disclosure. The old Keth's expression was unreadable. 300 years of political practice made it so. But there was something in the way his 6 hands rested very, very still on the arms of his seat. When Reeves finished, the chamber was very quiet. And then Thessaly Vrun spoke. Ambassador Graxis, she said carefully, does the Keth delegation have a statement? Graxis looked at her, then at Reeves, then around the chamber. And he said, the Keth delegation has nothing to say at this time and requests a separate recess. Which was, in council diplomatic language, the equivalent of saying, we need to talk about this privately before we say anything on the record. Which was, Reeves knew, not quite an admission. But it was not a denial either. Grand Speaker Han called for order and announced that the council would take a further recess. And while the chamber buzzed with the noise of 47 delegations trying to process the new development, Reeves stood on the obsidian floor and thought about Marcus Webb. He thought about what it must have been like for a man who had helped build something this extraordinary to decide that it needed to be shared with a power that could counter it. He thought about Lena Vasquez, who had built the technology so that humanity could be free. He thought about the difference between those two choices and whether they were as different as they seemed. He didn't have an answer, but he had a negotiation to complete. The Nightfall fleet moved. Maya gave the order with the calm precision of someone who had drilled this maneuver approximately 300 times in simulation, and the 42 invisible ships shifted their formation in a pattern that Lena Vasquez had called, with characteristic dry humor, the Ghost Waltz, a flowing, continuously shifting arrangement that made the fleet's gravity signature look to external gravitational mapping arrays, like a school of large, very fast fish. The effect on the 63 incoming Keth-allied vessels was immediate and obvious. Their formation, which had been tightening into an encircling configuration, a net beginning to close, stuttered. Stopped. Began reconfiguring. Their gravitational detectors were losing the map they'd spent 40 minutes building. They're adjusting, Aisha reported. But they've dropped their approach speed. They're recalibrating. Good. Keep us moving. Ghost waltz pattern, continuous. Don't let them rebuild a coherent map. Captain, Daniel said from his console, I'm seeing something interesting in their power signatures. 2 of the Keth vessels in the formation, the ones at the rear of their configuration, are generating unusual energy readings. Unusual how? They're not powering weapons. They're powering communication arrays. Very high-powered. Long range. He paused. They're transmitting something. Not to each other. Outsystem. They're calling for more? Tom Bradley said from navigation, with the voice of someone who did not find this idea appealing. No, Maya said slowly, watching the power signature data. High-powered long-range transmission. That's not a tactical call for reinforcement. That's a political call. She looked at Daniel. They're transmitting to their home world. They're reporting what happened here today. In real time. Because whatever happens next, Yuki said from communications, the Keth government needs to know before the council session concludes. Because whatever happens next changes everything, Maya said. She thought about the 63 ships that were now reconfiguring their formation, confused by the ghost waltz of her invisible fleet. She thought about the transmission going back to the Keth homeworld. She thought about Ambassador Graxus, sitting in a private recess in the council chamber, deciding what he was going to say when the chamber reconvened. She thought about what Reeves had said. Do not fire unless fired upon. She understood the order. She agreed with it. The entire point of Project Nightfall was not to fight a war. It was to make a war unnecessary by demonstrating that it would be unwinnable. That deterrent only worked if you didn't use the weapon. The moment you fired was the moment you lost the high ground, the moral clarity, the thing that Reeves had carefully built by walking into the council chamber instead of simply appearing in orbit with an ultimatum. But she also had 42 ships and 2,700 human beings under her command. And there were 63 hostile vessels out there, currently confused but adapting. And somewhere inside Project Nightfall's personnel list was a man who had given those vessels the tools to find her fleet. She thought about what she would do if they fired first. She found she didn't have to think about it very long. If they fired, she would answer. Precisely, surgically, decisively. Not to destroy if possible. Never to destroy. But to demonstrate, one more time, and in terms that could not be misunderstood, that the Nightfall fleet was not something you fired at and survived. Maintain the waltz, she said. And keep the weapons cold. In the council chamber, Ambassador Graxus returned from his private recess and asked to speak. The chamber granted him the floor. He stood at the base of the speaking tier, not quite on the obsidian floor where Reeves was standing, but near it, and he looked at the human commander for a long moment. Then he looked up at the assembled council. I will not insult this chamber, he said, by pretending that the Keth delegation has nothing to do with the fleet currently operating in the Selim sector. The chamber held its breath. What I will say, he continued, is that the Keth's concern, which I believe is a legitimate concern, even if our method of addressing it was not, was this, that humanity possessing this technology alone, without any counterbalancing capability, was a destabilizing factor in galactic security. Not because we believed humanity intended aggression, but because security based on a single civilization's restraint is no security at all. He looked at Reeves. You said the right things, Commander. Your technology disclosure was unexpected and impressive. But the Keth, and I think I speak for several delegations who have not said so publicly, needed to know that if humanity's restraint ever failed, there was a counter. Silence. That counter now exists, Graxus said. The complete technical specifications that Commander Reeves disclosed today will allow the Keth and every other member species to develop Nightfall technology of their own. Within a generation, this will not be exclusively human technology. It will be galactic technology. And at that point, the deterrence equation becomes stable again. He paused. The Keth delegation will therefore withdraw the fleet from the Selim sector. The entire chamber reacted at once. Reeves waited for the noise to subside. Then he said, Ambassador Graxus, I appreciate your honesty, and I understand the security concern. He paused. But I want to say something clearly for the record. Humanity did not disclose this technology because we were afraid of how the Council would respond if we kept it. We disclosed it because it was the right thing to do. Because a galaxy in which one species holds an exclusive military advantage is not a stable galaxy, regardless of that species' intentions. He looked at Graxus. We gave the technology away before we knew your fleet was in the sector. We gave it away before we knew about the leak. We gave it away because we made a decision 9 years ago when we started this program that the goal was never dominance. It was equality. And you cannot have genuine equality in a community where one member has a weapon everyone else is afraid of. He paused, and his voice was quieter now. So if the Keth were worried that humanity's restraint might fail, I want you to know that we understand that worry. We've had it ourselves. For 30 years, we've trusted that the Council's restraint would not fail, that the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy would use their advantage fairly. He held Graxus's gaze steadily. We weren't always sure that trust was warranted, but we chose to give it anyway. We're asking you to do the same. Graxus was still for a long time. Then he said something in the Keth language that the translation system rendered as a phrase that had no clean human equivalent. Something between, I acknowledge your words, and you have given me something to think about for a very long time. And the Keth fleet, slowly, turned and left the Selim sector. The vote took 3 hours. There were debates within debates, procedural arguments about the mechanism for renegotiating the accord, political arguments about the composition of any modified security committee, scientific arguments about the timeline for technology transfer, philosophical arguments about the nature of the Council's mandate that had apparently been building for decades and were now finally bursting out into the open because humanity had, without meaning to, kicked the door open. Reeves stood through all of it. When he was asked questions, he answered them. When he was not, he listened. He listened the way he had been listening in one way or another since he was 11 years old, and a Valorian spacecraft appeared in the sky, and the universe got significantly larger and more complicated. He listened, and he thought about Lena Vasquez, and he thought about Maya Chin and the ghost waltz of invisible ships in the Selim sector, and he thought about Marcus Webb and whatever Marcus Webb had believed he was doing when he made the choice he made, and he thought about his own reflection in the polished obsidian floor of this chamber, a single human standing in a space built for the meetings of civilizations far older than his own. He thought about what equality actually meant. Not sameness. Not identical power, or identical history, or identical values. Equality of standing, of voice, of the right to sit at the table and say, this is what we think, this is what we need, this is who we are, and to have that heard, and weighed, and taken seriously, not managed, not contained, not protected from the consequences of their own choices. Heard. When the vote finally came, it was 43-4 in favor of opening renegotiation of the new member accord. The 4 dissenters, not the Keth, who had, in the end, voted with the majority, which Reeves suspected reflected something significant in Graxus's private calculus, were species whose identities and political interests he would need to understand better in the months ahead, because today's session was not an end. It was a beginning. Grand Speaker Han's bioluminescent skin patterns produced something that the translation system rendered as, the Council of the Stars acknowledges the motion. Renegotiation of the new member accord will commence at the next full session. The United Earth Defense Force is invited to send a negotiating delegation. The Council further acknowledges Commander Reeves's technology disclosure and will convene a working group to oversee the transfer process. He paused, and his skin patterns changed to something that the translation system marked with a note indicating that it was an idiomatic expression not commonly used in formal sessions, something like a very old phrase meaning, when the young surprise the old. This council has not been surprised in a very long time, the translation rendered. It appears we needed to be. In the Selim sector, Captain Maya Chen received the news from Commander Reeves on the secure channel, and she sat with it for a moment in the quiet of the command bay.
We did it, she said.
We did, Reeves confirmed. Stand the fleet down from alert. Maintain Nightfall integrity for now. We'll transition to a disclosed formation tomorrow, once the Council has communicated the session outcomes to their home governments. A pause. How's the crew? Ready to sleep for a week, Maya said. But good. Good. Another pause, and his voice was less formally commander-shaped when he said, she would have been pleased. Maya knew who he meant. She designed the demonstration mode herself, she said. She always said the point was never to use it. She was right. She was right about most things. Maya looked at the tactical display, the 63 Keth vessels receding into the distance, the Council response fleet standing down to standard configuration, the gentle ghost waltz of the Nightfall fleet slowing to a drift. What happens now? Now we go home, Reeves said. And then we go back. To the table. Every session. Every negotiation. Every argument. We show up and we keep showing up until the table doesn't feel like it belongs to someone else. Maya nodded, though he couldn't see her. And Marcus Webb? She asked quietly. A long pause. That's a conversation I need to have with him directly, Reeves said. Before I know what he deserves, I need to know what he believed. Another pause. That's how it should work, don't you think? Maya thought about a man who had helped build something extraordinary and had made a choice that complicated it enormously, for reasons that might have been love or conscience or both, and about how those reasons mattered even when the action demanded accountability. Yes, she said. That's how it should work. 3 weeks later, In a small conference room in UEDF headquarters in Geneva, Commander James Reeves sat across from Dr. Marcus Webb and listened. Marcus was 40 years old, with the kind of face that looked like it had been doing a lot of work lately, not physical work, but the internal kind, the work of living inside a decision you couldn't unmake and weren't sure you were sorry about. He was quiet at the beginning. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Reeves. "I told them," he said, "because I was afraid." "Of what?" Reeves asked. "Of what we were building," Marcus said. Not the technology. The technology is extraordinary. What Lena made is extraordinary. But I kept thinking about what we were going to do with it. The plan was to walk in there and show them, and I kept thinking, what if they respond with force? What if we start a war we can't finish? What if we terrify them so badly that they decide the safest thing is to destroy us before we become something they can't handle? He looked at his hands again. I thought if the Keth knew, if someone knew in advance, there would be a counter. A deterrent against our deterrent. That it would be more stable. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "You were trying to create stability," he said. "I was trying to make sure no one died," Marcus said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I know how that sounds. I know what I did. I know I betrayed the program, and I know I broke every oath I took, and I know I know there are consequences. I just need you to know that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Reeves looked at him for a long time. He thought about Lena and what she had said about the purpose of the technology. He thought about Graxus and his speech about security based on restraint. He thought about a young man in love with a Keth cultural attaché, lying awake at night running the scenarios, trying to find the version that didn't end in catastrophe. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that Marcus Webb had been afraid of exactly the right thing, and had responded to that fear in exactly the wrong way, and that both of those things were true at the same time. HFY. Reeves said it was a phrase he had learned from a Valorian linguistics exchange, one of those concepts that didn't translate cleanly but roughly meant from this point to me, meaning from now this is mine to carry. He used it the way he had learned it was used, as an acknowledgement of responsibility. A willingness to own the weight of something. "What?" Marcus asked. "It means, from this point this belongs to me," Reeves said. "The decision about what comes next, the consequence, the accountability. It's mine, not a system's. I'm going to look at what you did and figure out what you deserve and what the program deserves and what both of those things look like when they're both true. That's going to take some time. But you'll know." Marcus nodded slowly. "And Marcus," Reeves said, "for what it's worth, the stability you were trying to create, it worked out, not the way you planned." But Graxus stood up in that chamber and said that the reason the Keth response made sense was because they needed a counter. And the counter is the technology we gave away, which is the thing that Lena always said would make us safe.
He paused.
"You made the wrong choice for a reason that wasn't entirely wrong. I'm not sure what to do with that, but I'm not going to pretend it's simple." Marcus Webb put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. Reeves waited. 6 months later, the first renegotiated provisions of the new member accord came into force. Humanity's territory allocation was expanded by a factor of 4. The trade tariff structure was replaced with a genuinely reciprocal framework that had been negotiated over 8 full council sessions by a human delegation that, as one Valorian journalist noted with some surprise, turned out to be exceptionally good at this. The quarterly military inspections ended. A modified security committee was convened, with human representation included from the first session. The Nightfall technology transfer was completed. 6 species, including the Keth, had begun construction of their own dark matter field systems. 3 more had submitted requests to join the working group. The galaxy's military landscape was, as Lena Vasquez had predicted and Graxus had ultimately argued, becoming more stable rather than less, because security based on shared capability was more durable than security based on any single civilization's restraint. Commander Reeves was appointed as humanity's first permanent representative to the Council's Security Committee. Captain Maya Chun was promoted to admiral and given command of the expanded UEDF's First Fleet, a formation that, for the first time in humanity's 31 years as a spacefaring civilization, operated openly, disclosed, with Council acknowledgement, as one of the primary security forces in the Sealam sector. Ambassador Thessaly Vrun retired at the end of the year. In her retirement statement, she said that she had spent 60 years as a diplomat and that the most important thing she had learned in those 60 years was that the most dangerous assumption in any relationship was the assumption that you understood what the other party was capable of. She sent Commander Reeves a personal message the day she retired. It said, "You surprised me. That is the greatest compliment I know how to give." He had it framed. Dr. Lena Vasquez's name was inscribed on the wall of UEDF headquarters in Geneva. Not in the section that commemorated combat casualties. In a new section, created specifically for her, with a title that the UEDF's chief historian had spent 3 weeks perfecting. It read, "Those who built the key." Because that was what she had done. Not built a weapon. Not built a threat. Built a key to a door that had been locked for 30 years. She had known from the beginning what the key was actually for. And on the obsidian floor of the Council Chamber of the Stars, where Commander James Reeves had stood alone and changed the course of galactic history with 42 invisible ships and a technology disclosure, there was now a small marker. The Council had placed it there after the first renegotiated session. It was inscribed in 47 languages. In English, it said, "Here, the conversation changed. Not the galaxy, not history, not the balance of power. The conversation. Because in the end, after all the ships and the sensors and the dark matter fields and the political maneuvering and the fear and the awe and the long negotiations, that was what it had actually been. A civilization that had been talked at for 30 years had finally found a way to be heard. And the galaxy, slowly, carefully, not without difficulty, had started to listen. The end.